This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we got a special return guest to the podcast, and that is Alisa Childers. So she is a former contemporary Christian music recording artist turned Christian apologist, and she's a podcast alum. She's been on episode 373 and 318 of this podcast. But I got to tell you, our episode today, I enjoyed those other two interviews a lot. This one's probably the best of the three. And if you've heard her name before, it's probably because you heard her as a part of the all-female Christian pop music group ZOEgirl back in the day. I know you got some ZOEgirl fans out in the crowd here. But after her music career, she found her way into the world of Christian apologetics. She's been an outspoken opponent and critic of progressive Christianity. She wrote the book Another Gospel and Live Your Truth, and that's when we had her on previous episodes to talk about those a little bit. But she has a new book out now called The Deconstruction of Christianity, what it is, why it's destructive, and how to respond. And this is a book that she co-wrote with Tim Barnett. We'll be releasing our interview with Tim a little bit later to discuss this book as well. But basically, there is this deconstruction movement that is happening in modern Christianity, and most people either aren't talking about it or don't know how to talk about it. Maybe they don't even know how deconstruction should be defined. Maybe they're confused as to what the tenets of it are. Maybe they actually think, well, this seems pretty practical. Doesn't it make sense to just deconstruct your Christianity and then build it back up? The nefarious thing and the problem is, and we talked about this in the interview, a lot of people never reconstruct. The entire point of the process of deconstruction is the deconstruction itself. And so we talk about deconstruction. We talk about why co-writing a book when she swore she wasn't going to write a book for a while. So we get into that a little bit. But then we talk about some very specific things like what is the goal of deconstruction for most people? Because there really is an end goal. But also most of the people that are deconstructing, they tend to lean towards the same political beliefs. These are people that are typically leftists. And so what about the people that might just say, well, hey, let's just fight this philosophically. Let's fight this in the political sphere. Why not? We don't need to fight it spiritually. We talk a little bit about Kristen Kobes-Dumais and Jesus and John Wayne and how she and others are basically steeping themselves and marinating these cells in the works of people like Foucault and Gramsci and Habermas, and how that leads to some of their nonsense views that they spray out to everybody. But then we also talk about Christians and how our politics should be downstream from our theology, and it's not. And how these Christians are not equipped for this fight because even people that describe themselves as evangelicals, they don't believe that Jesus is God. They don't believe that Jesus pays for our sins and that we have to put our faith in that. They believe that there are multiple roads to God. These are people that think that they're evangelicals, right? And then even just evangelicalism, how would you even define that? But we talk about how the church has really done no favors because of the lack of discipleship. We do also talk about Calvinism and how one of the points of Calvinism, the L part, so limited atonement, how that could lead people, or not necessarily lead people to deconstruction, but people that are already deconstructing that have kind of a theological bend, how that could add gasoline to the fire of the things that they're going through. And then we talk a little bit more about how we can practically deal with the process of, what if I have a family member that's in the process of deconstructing? What if my daughter says that I'm toxic and that I believe horrible things and that I can't see my grandbabies because I believe such terrible things and I vote for people that are reprehensible, according to them, of course. So we talk about that and a whole lot more in this episode. I love every time Alisa comes on here. We always have a great conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alisa Childers, this is your third time here on Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I don't know what you're trying to do. Are you trying to creep into my space here? Like, you handle the ladies, I got the guys. What's going on here?
It reminds me of the Office episode where Dwight says to Angela, "You can be in charge of the women." Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. It's a great quote.
And she just like the delight and pride that comes over her. No, not exactly that, but I'm glad to be back with you.
Well, and as you have said before, like, you're not elbowing into my territory because even on your show, it's pretty split. You got a pretty even keel split of guys and gals that listen. Over here, it's a little bit rougher. So the 10% of lionesses that listen to this, they're pretty much thugs. So we love them. But, the thing that's been fun about knowing you for as long as I've known you, being friends and kind of watching your career and different things, you have to have seen a lot of fruit come from the work that you've done, not just the books, Live Your Truth, great title, and then Another Gospel, and then the new book that we're going to talk about now. But we were even just talking off air about some of the downstream fruits that you're seeing of just some of the interviews that you've done. So I just wanted to give you a chance to, maybe brag on yourself. And if you don't take the bait, I will brag on you for you. But just some of the fruit that you've seen from the work that you've done, because again, you used to be a recording artist and now you're doing this kind of stuff. And I'm sure you didn't really think in your 20s that this would be what you would be doing. So flow on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I did not think I would ever be a speaker or an author writing books or anything like that. So it's all been kind of a surprise and it's been a fun ride. But I do think that some of the more encouraging notes that I get or some of the feedback I get when I speak at churches around the country is really what keeps me going, because you can see, it's like you know this, Kyle. You go on an online platform and people are just not nice on the internet, right? People, they're not kind-hearted. They don't, it's like the keyboard warrior thing. And so, people say a lot of mean things, which, it's fine. That's what we know that we're setting ourselves up for that. But it's the times when somebody will come up to me after I speak with tears in their eyes saying, I went through something very similar that you went through, and you were really a lifeboat for me. And so in my ministry, the lifeboat metaphor is something that I talk about a lot, because when I was drowning in doubt and I didn't know where to turn for information, I just remember people like Frank Turek and Greg Koukl and J. Warner Wallace were like lifeboats for me. Like I was drowning and I just got to get in the boat. And so it's always my hope that I get to be lifeboats for other people. So whenever somebody says that to me, it always means a little something extra special, and you get to see the fruit of it and just more on a one-on-one kind of situation. So it's really, truly a blessing. And I don't just say that as a platitude. It really blesses me when I hear things like that.
Well, the great thing about that as well is I just got an email this morning, which I'm sure you've received similar emails to this. It's like, you gave words to what I was thinking, but didn't know how to express. And so, having Koukl and J. Warner Wallace and Frank Turek, like all guys that have been on the show before, like that's why I have guys like that on the show, because I never know when I'm going to run into an attack of like, oh my gosh, this is a really great point that someone made. I don't know how to address that. Well, it's like Greg Koukl addressed that probably in 1984. Like, I just need to go back and read some of the stuff that he's done. And that reminds me of when you were talking through another gospel where you were basically going back to some of the early church fathers, some of the earliest writers, to be like, I'm not the only one that's been distracted by these thoughts. I'm not the only one that's been, kind of knocked off of my path by these thoughts. But you kind of have this thing where in a very sweet way, you attack sacred cows, right? So we were talking off air about the Enneagram. We were talking about some of the interviews that you've done, but now you're taking a hit at deconstruction. So you have a new book that you co-wrote called The Deconstruction of Christianity, what it is, why it's destructive, and how to respond. This is a book that you co-wrote with Tim Barnett. So he's the red pin guy on TikTok, and I'm going to be interviewing him soon to ask him what in the world is up with the red pin when it's actually a marker. Come on, Tim, you're not fooling anybody. But you're doing an entire book on the subject of deconstruction. You give a definition in the book that faith deconstruction is a postmodern process of rethinking your faith without regarding Scripture as the standard. So just take me into the whole process of, okay, why do another book? Because the last time we talked, you were like, I can't do another book. And then you sign on to do another book. And then you probably have 2 more books lined up. Why co-write it? Because as people read it, it's going to be a little bit weird, because y'all will even vacillate from paragraph to paragraph who writes it. And so I'm thinking it's Alisa talking, but it's actually Tim. A little bit confusing, but I'm not the smartest guy around. Just give me the background on the book, and then we'll dig in.
Yeah, well, back, I would say about 2 years ago, I was hip deep in finishing up Live Your Truth and Other Lies. And like you said, I did not want to write another book. I just thought, oh man, I can't wait to finish this. Yeah. And then just take 2 years where I don't write any books. But I started to see Tim, who, we had worked together on a couple of things in the past, and I started to see him posting on social media about deconstruction. And I didn't see anybody else really talking about it in a way that I thought, okay, they really get it. But Tim was doing that. He was calling out the deconstructionists. He was doing talks about it. And I was really encouraged to see that, because to my knowledge, I was really the only person saying what I was saying about it and how it would relate to progressive Christianity and other things like that. And so I remember Tim texted me one day and he said, hey, you need to write a book on this topic. And then I told him what I told you. I said, no, I do not want to write another book. I'm like, when I finish this, I am done for 2 years at least. I need to take a break. And he said, well, what if, would you be open to co-writing one? And the second he said that, I thought, oh, this seems like the right thing to do. And so I just said, let's talk. And so we started talking, and it just led into writing the book. And it was a beast to write, though. The research was, it's really dark. It's a dark place, that deconstruction hashtag. It's very toxic. It's a really unhealthy, even just emotionally, it's a really dark place to be. And so it was really a sacrifice to write this book because it was not fun to research. It was not particularly fun to write. But I do think that with Tim and I, like you said, we'll vacillate between whose voice is what. But I can honestly say that every word is both of us. Like, we took ownership of every single word. And so I'm really proud of it. And I hope that it helps the body of Christ because, you read the definition earlier, our definition. I don't know how much your audience knows about how people are talking about deconstruction, but our definition is actually kind of controversial. To my knowledge, not a lot of other people are framing deconstruction the way we're framing it. So it's kind of fun to wade into those waters as well and kind of be the underdog saying, no, I don't think people are getting this right.
Well, and you're poking a sacred cow, and you're poking at something that a lot of people won't define, because if they define it, then they have to defend it. And so you're actually putting a definition out there that you have to defend. But it's commendable what you and Tim did, because I remember talking to John Cooper throughout his process of writing Wimpy, Weak, and Woke, which came out at the end of last year. And just, gosh, he was ready to, just bang his head into a brick wall, because it's just like, this is so dark. It's so depraved. It's like last year I talked about on my show, I spent a week watching videos, looking at pictures, and reading descriptions of what Hamas did to people in Israel. And the reason that I did it is so that I could describe it to people that wouldn't do that themselves, but the way that I could describe it to them to be like, hey, evil is real. Like, we can't just let 2 weeks go by and be like, why is Israel being so mean to these poor people in Gaza? It's like, nope, we don't get to do that. But you need people that are going to be wading into those dark waters. But my encouragement to the people in the audience is pray for you, pray for Tim, pray for John Cooper, pray for these people that are going into these dark areas, because you can go into these dark areas, but then you're going to come out smelling like smoke. And that's not always the best thing. One awesome thing right from the jump of this book is the gangster Carl Truman himself wrote the foreword. So guys, if you have not read The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, again, if you're like me, it's going to be a hard read because there's not a whole lot going up on there, but it's a great book. It's a must read. It's a book that's on our book list that everyone should read. But there's so many things about this, Alisa, and we're going to dive into a bunch of different things from the book. But just generically, in your opinion, what is the most nefarious thing about the growing ubiquity of deconstruction? And we'll just use y'all's definition, but within y'all's definition, within that rubric, what's the most nefarious thing going on?
I think the most nefarious thing about deconstruction is that it's very singular in its goal. So if you go on all the deconstruction hashtags, they'll say, oh, there's no goal. It doesn't matter where you land. But if you really read more posts, what you see is there is a very focused goal in deconstruction. And that goal is to get you to leave the historic Christian faith.
Right.
That's really what it is. They do not care if you become a Buddhist. They do not care if you become a humanist, a Satanist, a progressive Christian. They do not care where you land as long as you leave historically Christian beliefs that they deem to be toxic, abusive, and harmful. And that's really what it is. And so this is why Tim and I are so concerned about otherwise maybe conservative Christian leaders talking about deconstruction as if it can be this healthy process. It's okay, just deconstruct with the Bible in your hand or deconstruct based on truth. But our question is, why are you using a postmodern word that has a very specific manifestation in culture to describe a healthy and biblical process? That makes no sense at all. And so in the book, that's why we're saying, no, deconstruction is this thing. It is unhealthy. It leads you away from Christian beliefs. And we ought not try to baptize the word to mean something positive or biblical or healthy.
Well, Alisa, you know this to be true. We worship at the altar of pragmatism right now. Like, we come to the feet of what's practical and pragmatic and what works. Well, Alisa, this seems to work. Why are you being so mean about this? Like, is this your hill to die on? It's like, well, no, this isn't my hill to die on. I'll die on the hill of not killing babies when they're in the womb. But this is still really, really important, because y'all are playing with stuff that you don't even understand. And that's the thing that I just don't get with these people. Like, these people wouldn't walk into a chemical factory and start mixing crap together, but they're taking all these different deadly worldviews and they're just kind of like sprinkling it over what they do at church already. It's like, guys, get out of here. But I think a furtherance of what you just said is this quote here that I want to read, where you and Tim, I don't know who, it's always a guess, but it's the 3 things about deconstruction. So 3 things about deconstruction. 1, deconstruction is not about getting your theology right. 2, there is no end goal or destination to the deconstruction process. There is just a never-ending skepticism of your view. And then 3, there is no external authority to tell you that what your view should look like. You are the ultimate authority. And this is the question I guess I would want to ask, is when we talk about any of these things, it's always me-focused. Postmodernism leads to my truth. Standpoint epistemology leads to my lived experience and how that gives me secret knowledge about the world. And same thing with deconstruction. There is no higher authority than the self. It sounds like a lot of this kind of new age stuff that I've been kind of steeped in here a little bit recently behind the scenes. Because when you focus on yourself, how can you be wrong? Because you are your arbiter of truth. So talk to me a little bit about just the nefarious side of the you focus to all of this.
What people need to understand about deconstruction, and particularly we're analyzing how it's manifesting online, because that is where it's mostly happening. Because of the nature of it, people have already determined that their Christian friends and families are toxic, they're harmful people, they're not safe, the churches are not safe, and not just because maybe there's an unhealthy leadership structure, but simply because of the beliefs. These are what are considered toxic and harmful and abusive. So because of that, the impetus to disconnect from their Christian family and friends and churches and then find community on these online deconstruction spaces, that is where it is happening. And so when we talk about the focus on me, and you said it perfectly when you quoted, well, I guess we said it perfectly because you were quoting us,
right.
But it's not about getting your theology right. And they will agree with that. In fact, it's interesting when people go into the deconstruction hashtag and they'll say things like, just deconstruct, but deconstruct with the Bible in your hand. They will make fun of those people because that's not what deconstruction is.
Right.
It's a completely self-led process. And so basically what you do in deconstruction is you analyze all of the beliefs that were handed to you. Maybe it's substitutionary atonement. Maybe it's the doctrine of hell. Maybe it's the concept of biblical authority. And this is where the postmodernism comes in, and this is what I really hope to help your audience understand, is, when it comes to things like religion and morality, our postmodern culture has decided that those things are more like your favorite flavor of ice cream or what sports team you like to root for. These are opinions and preferences. Anything you might believe about what we should or shouldn't do morally, or who we should worship, or how we should worship. Like you said, it's all in the altar of pragmatism. Whatever works for you. And I wish that I would have thought of this, but one of my guests on my podcast said the greatest line. Her name's Alexa Kramer, and she said, and it was actually about the Enneagram, and she said, the enemy will make sure something works for you as long as it's not true. And I thought that was a really great statement because, sometimes things feel like they work, but they're not true, or they're actually bad for us in the long run. And so what our audience needs to understand about the postmodern influence in deconstruction is that it is absolutely not about lining up your beliefs with reality. It's about lining up your beliefs with what feels right to you. So anything that makes you feel harmed or oppressed, you get rid of that belief and you replace it with a belief that works for you, one that maybe makes you feel like you have more peace in your life. And so that's why we say it's a postmodern process, because as you know, there are things in the Christian faith, in the Christian worldview, that don't feel good all the time. There are things where we are called to repent for things that, if I was just left to my own devices, I'd say, hey, I think this is just fine for me, right? This is great. I'm loving this. This is working for me. But yet the Bible would call me to repent of that thing. And so the Bible calls us to repent and to turn from things that our inner moral compass might actually be in tension with. And so that's where truth comes in, though. Truth is when you say what is real. You line up what you believe with reality. Whereas in the deconstruction hashtag, you line up your beliefs based on what makes you feel right and what makes you feel less, toxic and harmful. And so this is why in our book we talk about the just myriad of people who have come up to me after I've spoken at a church, usually older, elderly people with tears in their eyes saying, my adult child has deconstructed. And what they're trying to understand is, why does that deconstruction end with my child not wanting to talk to me anymore? And even many have received no contact letters. You're a toxic person. You can't see your grandkids. And so, it's taken the church. I think a lot of church people are very shocked when that happens to them. And it's way more common than most people realize. But adult children rejecting their parents, even relationship with their parents, not because of something they did, but simply because of what they believe. And that's really what's happening at the bottom of this deconstruction movement.
Yeah, somebody clip that out, wake Lecrae up and share it with them. That was gold right there. Now, I wasn't intending to ask about this, but this came to mind when you just described the situation you just described. There are a lot of things kind of swimming around in this witch's brew of postmodernism. This isn't something that started in a particular year. But Alisa, I think 2016 broke everyone's brains. All these liberals or all these well-meaning moderates, if that's even a thing, when Trump got elected and a bunch of evangelicals held their nose and looked at the fact that the Supreme Court's important and still held out hope that Roe v. Wade could possibly one day maybe be overturned. Who knew it was going to happen as fast as it did? But Trump just literally broke people's brains. I think Trump broke Andy Stanley. I think Trump broke Lecrae. I think Trump broke, pick a person that maybe has deconstructed, and it all comes back, again, it comes back to this, they bought the cultural Marxist lie of standpoint epistemology, and they just can't see. They're like, oh, well, mom and dad, if you can support a racist bigot like Donald Trump that says the things he says about Mexican people, then I just can't be around you. But now they can cloak it in this Christianese of, well, I've deconstructed, and it's your theology, mom and dad. It's your theology, grandma and grandpa, that I just can't be down with. These are things that we used to just roll our eyes at Thanksgiving dinner. But now these are certified letters coming in the mail saying, don't talk to me anymore, you racist, horrible bigot. I mean, that's kind of my read of the situation, but goodness gracious, I started this podcast when Donald Trump got elected, right after. So I've just been following the thread this entire way. What do you think?
Oh, I think you've absolutely nailed it on the head. I don't know that I've heard a deconstruction story since 2016 where Donald Trump wasn't a key figure in the deconstruction.
Right.
You're right. It broke people's brains is a good way to put it, because whether you like the guy or whether you don't like the guy, his influence in the deconstruction, I would say the evangelical support of Trump, that in particular, that component was massive in so many deconstruction stories. And the thing that makes me sad is that it's like the breaking of the brain. People are unable now to pull things apart and think critically, like, oh, I can actually dislike this guy as a person, but think, okay, well, here are my two choices. I like these policies. I'm going to vote here, even though I don't like the guy. Or maybe people really like the guy. And either way, though, it's like they get villainized because of the action that they took. And that can span the gamut from being called a Christian nationalist just simply because you might be conservative politically, all the way to, it's just, you broke people's brains is really the right way to put it, because that's what you see. You don't see any deconstruction stories really that don't mention that political element and directly in regard to Donald Trump.
Well, even specifically, when I say it broke people's brains, it destroyed their ability to be intellectually honest, because they can't just calmly have a discussion anymore, because we have been convinced that our level of outrage equals our level of rightness. And so if I throw a brick through a window when I get mad, I'm right, because that's an extreme thing to do, or we used to think that was an extreme thing to do. I don't want to really go down the political side. I want to kind of bring it back to this, but I mean, this is going to end up being on the political side as well. I want to read a couple of quotes here from the book. As we'll see, for many in the hashtag Evangelical community, evangelical is perceived to be synonymous with misogyny, racism, homophobia, and the political support of Donald Trump. And then a little bit later, Alisa, you and Tim talk about 5 characteristics of what ex-evangelicals are leaving behind. And this is according to Blake Chastain. He's the guy that actually came up with the term ex-evangelical. So here are the 5 things he said these people are leaving behind. Number 1, a literal reading of the Bible. Number 2, a belief that women are to be submissive to men. Number 3, a belief in the sanctity of heterosexuality, heteronormativity, and the rejection of homosexuality as sinful. Number 4, the assumption that the American way of life is best. And number 5, identification and partnership with political and social conservatism. So my question here is essentially, this movement is just leftism, progressivism, postmodernism, wokeism, cultural Marxism, put whatever ism you have in there. Alisa, why don't we just fight this philosophy politically? Why don't we just fight this philosophically? Like, why do we need to take it? And I know the answer. I'm setting you up here to just hit a home run, so please do it. But it's like, I know what I would say to that, but this seems like some people would be like, y'all are making a big deal about this. Let's just fight this philosophically. Let's fight it in the classroom. Let's fight it politically. Let's just get these people out of office. But we don't need to make it this big spiritual deal. What do you say to those people?
So are you talking, I want to make sure I understand your question. You're talking about the deconstructionists would be saying that, or?
Well, I'm saying that people that don't think deconstruction is that big a deal. So that could that could include deconstructionists, but people that are just like, y'all are making this big hill to die on. You know what? This just sounds like leftism. So these are like conservatives that aren't Christians, because people think that those two things are one and the same. But these are just political conservatives that are like, no, this is a philosophical war. This is a war that we're going to fight in the political sphere. We don't need to make it all godly and godlike. What would you say to some of those people that seem to not think it's a big deal?
Right. Well, I think they don't think it's a big deal because they are not understanding the nature of truth, right? This is why it's so interesting when we've seen the influx of critical theory, how we see even like atheists and Christians being on the same side, or as Boghossian, I think, put it, in the same reality tunnel, because we may disagree about what, the nature of something is. Like as far as religion, with the atheist, we might say, well, the atheist believes there's an objective reality about God. He just thinks God doesn't exist. Whereas the Christian also believes there's an objective reality about God, and he believes God does exist. We can have a discussion. We can have a debate because we're on the same playing field. We're in the same reality tunnel. But what I think is going on is that a lot of people think it's no big deal because they are not understanding that this is an erosion of objective truth itself. And, you mentioned standpoint epistemology and all these different definitions of truth and way of knowing what is true. And I think a lot of people are just like, oh, it's not a big deal because just let people do their thing and you can let other people do their thing. But that's because they are buying into the idea that truth is just, you're the truth maker for yourself. And whatever you think, is going to work is going to work. And so I think it's really a battle over that word truth and what that means. And again, like I said, the Christians and the atheists aren't always going to agree on what is true about reality, but they agree there is a truth that at least in partiality can be known.
I think you're right. And this actually flows right into the next question, because you just sometimes have to listen to these people and what they say. And I'm just going to say this, Alisa. I look back on my life with regret. There are times when I should have zigged. Instead, I zagged, and there's mistakes that I've made, but then there's just those opportunities that just like, it was like, you're trying to grab a fistful of water and they just didn't happen. And so one of those is I was supposed to debate Kristen Kobes-Dumez on the Unbelievable Show with Justin Brierley. And I literally think about that all the time because I was ready to smash her to pieces. It was going to be a bloodbath. But she did an interview with Justin because she didn't want to debate me. And then Justin set me up with another Christian feminist who found out it was going to be me and then decided that they didn't want to debate. They just wanted to do an interview. And I was just like, okay, apparently this isn't going to be a thing. But y'all put that trigger point in there in your book, okay? And I took the bait, so we're going to have to talk about it. So here's a quote from your book. For example, when asked on Twitter how one can best analyze power and cultural systems so as to not be held captive by them, Kristen Dumez responded, I should have a better answer, but for me, it wasn't one source, but years spent reading social and cultural histories of gender, Foucault, Gramsci, Adorno, Habermas, learning to be curious about how the world works. So, let's look at our scorecards. Foucault, communist. Gramsci, the father of neo-Marxism. Adorno, the leader of the Frankfurt School. And then Habermas, a proponent of critical social theory. So when I see these Christians, especially Christian women, and you've said it before sometimes, and we see this in Scripture too, you can kind of get romanced by things that men don't get romanced by. But you have these people that have been spending, by their own admission, years marinating in not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian, a-Christian, ideologies and philosophies, and then Christian publishing houses just turn their brains off and publish their nonsense books and just say, oh, well, we want to make sure people have a voice, as if they themselves, the authors, don't have Twitter. Talk to me a little bit about that. I don't even have a fully formulated question on that, but I was just like, guys, like I don't even have to give commentary. You just point, look what she said, look what she believes. Is it any shock she came to believe these things? Ready, set, go.
Yeah, so this is I'm really glad you brought this up, because there's the sort of deconstruction explosion that's very overtly anti-Christian, right? There's the people who are saying Christianity is toxic and you need to leave. But then there's this sort of subset. And I think it was Neil Shenvi that coined the phrase, the Evangelical Deconstruction Project, or it might have been Gushy. I'm not sure which one coined that. But that was in reference to a group of self-professed, at the time at least, self-professed evangelicals who were writing books to hopefully reform the evangelical church. Now, in many cases, like in the case of Kristin Du Mez, claiming to be a reformed Christian, right? That anytime you say you're a reformed Christian, the connotation is that you're very conservative, you know. And so a lot of evangelicals were buying these books that were written by these Evangelical Deconstruction Project authors, things like off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember them. Jesus and John Wayne, of course, the Beth Allison Barr book, Making of Biblical Womanhood. There was the Taking Our Nation Back for God. That might not be right, but it was the one on Christian nationalism. Rediscipling the White Church, all these kinds of books that really brought critical theory to the forefront of the evangelical mindset. These were all, at the time, or mostly, authors who are claiming to be very conservative Christians. And so a lot of evangelicals were like, oh, this Jesus and John Wayne book, this is great. This is written by a Reformed Christian, you know. And what they didn't realize is that these books are right in line with the deconstruction movement. Right. Again, everything that they're teaching is eroding the Christian worldview. Another interesting thing about Du Mez, I can't remember if we put this in the book or not, but she, you know, if you read the book, she's, again, claiming to be kind of conservative on these things. And she had said something about homosexuality, and Denny Burke went on Twitter and kind of confronted her and said, hey, I was under the impression that you maybe, I'm trying to remember exactly how he worded it, but basically he was questioning her views on homosexuality. And instead of answering him in a tweet, she ended up writing a blog post. And she wrote this long blog post about how she's thinking about the homosexuality question, but she ended by basically saying, look, I'm going to process this question in community with my gay brothers and sisters. And what that told me everything I needed to know right there, is that she's fully bought into standpoint epistemology, which basically is the idea that moral truths are better known by people who are more oppressed. That would be the most simple way I could put it. So the people who would have the highest moral authority to speak to the LGBTQ issue would be LGBTQ people in her mind. And so that tells me she's already made up her mind. She's already decided that she's going to yield to people who have this particular struggle, or maybe have already openly affirmed it. And so it's standpoint epistemology. And then she, of course, in that tweet that you mentioned before, openly admits that she's been studying all these postmodern philosophers like Michel Foucault. And that's the thing that surprises me, too, is that it's not difficult to see the influence of postmodern philosophers like Foucault and Derrida in the deconstruction hashtag, but in many cases, especially in the cases of progressive Christians, they're openly admitting this. Rachel Held Evans, in the book that was published after her death, she's quoting Derrida all over the place, and actually says that her motive, and again, I don't like to guess people's motives, but when they tell you their motive, that you should believe them. Right. And she said, basically, I'm going to this postmodern philosopher who undermines the meaning of words and text because, she literally says this, because I refuse to believe that God committed some of the acts in the Old Testament that the Old Testament authors ascribed to him. So she's basically saying the whole reason I'm bringing in this postmodern worldview is because I refuse to believe that the Bible is true at face value. And so that's what we see. It's not just like, we're not guessing. Tim and I are not guessing in this book as to what people are doing. They're outright telling us. I just think in a lot of cases, a lot of Christians are not paying attention.
Oh, they're certainly not paying attention. And the thing is you and Tim have already gotten and will continue to get criticism for noticing. It's like, how dare you notice what we're doing? And then it turns from, you know what, I'm glad you noticed because this is a good thing. And you know what, you should shout it from the rooftops that it's a good thing. And this gets into the whole deal about Christians that are just so dunderheaded where it's like they use pronoun hospitality, right? So they know somebody is presenting themselves as female when they're actually a male because they're wearing a dress, but they also have a beard longer than mine. And they're going to say, you know what? I'm going to use these pronouns because I don't want to be needlessly divisive. But you know what's not a good thing? Lying to people. You know what's also not good? Allowing people to make you lie, right? So if you told me your name was Charlotte and not Alisa, I would call you Charlotte. Is that a lie? Well, no, I was going off the information I had. But if you told me your name was Jimmy and that you're a man and I start referring to you as he, him, his, no, that's a big problem. You are causing me to sin. You're causing me to break the commandments of God so that I could be nice. I don't really get it. But this gets into a discussion about where Christians get their ideology. So there's a short quote here that I kind of quibble with a little bit, but the quote was this: for Christians, politics will flow downstream from theology. To which I would say, not really. Certainly not in modernity. I mean, there are self-described Christians, air quote Christians, that openly and proudly vote for political candidates that are pro-abortion, pro-transing of the kids, anti-parents' rights, whatever thing you're into. And then for ex-evangelicals, it's the exact opposite. Their politics is upstream and forms their theology. And then it's all these go along to get along. I want to be known for what I'm for, not what I'm against. These nicey nice Christians that allow culture to be upstream from their theology, to allow politics to be upstream from their theology. So again, the quote just caught me funny. Again, the quote was, for Christians, politics will flow downstream from theology. I just don't think I agree with that.
Well, it should at least.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
That might be a better nuance there. Yeah, well, and I don't know if we talked about this last time, but that was really based on some sociological research that was released a couple of years ago by a sociologist named George Yancey, and his book that he put out is One Faith No Longer. And that's what he really discovered when he was researching the views of conservative Christians versus progressive Christians. For true conservative Christians, where the Bible is our authority, the politics flows out of theology. So what we believe theologically is going to inform how we vote, or at least it should, right?
Should.
But for progressive Christians, it was the opposite. The politics started first, and then they would form their theology based around their political views, which was actually not a surprise to me. And you know what's interesting about that, Kyle, is when you think about the definitions that people have for Christian nationalism, it's actually the progressive Christian view that's more Christian nationalist than what conservatives tend to get accused of.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of irony there in that one.
The irony is my favorite, because when people are like, well, you're acting like a Christian nationalist, I was like, well, first of all, what do you mean by Christian and what do you mean by nationalist? Because typically they can't get either one of those terms right. And here's just a good pro tip for people. If you can't understand the individual words, don't combine them and try to think of a new meaning for that combination of words. But the thing that I think is undercurrent to all of this, Alisa, is we as Christians, so, the big group, capital C Christians, we are just simply not equipped for this fight. Because you know what? You and Tim should not have had to write this book. It should not have been something that we should have had to have done. But evangelicals, I forget if it was Barna or something in the book, where there are self-described evangelicals that don't believe cornerstone Christian doctrine. Like some of them don't believe in the resurrection. Some of them don't believe that Jesus, his payment for sins and our repentance leads us to Christ, or leads us to heaven. They think there are a lot of ways to get there. So these are self-described evangelicals that don't believe these core doctrines. And it's because Christians are completely almost biblically illiterate. I think it's because we don't actually believe the Bible is the Word of God. Because if we actually believe that, we would read it more than we would read Harry Potter. But we don't actually believe it as modern Christians. It's just another book that we just have to blow the dust off of a few times a year as we march into church. But I think the other thing is the church has some responsibility here, Alisa, because we don't disciple people anymore. Like we put you in a room, we start the smoke machines, we do our 4 songs. The third song always has 17 bridges and choruses. And then we do our TED Talk with Bible verses sprinkled over the top. Everybody grabs a latte and a bag of chips on the way out, and then they're good to go. There's no discipleship. You may raise your hand, after, the salesman got up there and gave you his pitch. but then they don't catch you in a net. They don't put you in a group of people. They don't find you a believer with gray hair that's going to help lead you through some of your questions. Like, you're a baby deer, but they don't care, right? They're just going to throw you out there with the rest of the hunters. So just flow a little bit on the fact that we're just flat out not equipped. And if you want to blame the church, great, I'm with you. If you want to blame Christians individually for being biblically illiterate, yeah, go for it. But man, we're bringing a knife to a gunfight here, and I hate it.
Okay, a couple of thoughts, and I want to say off the bat what the two are so I don't miss one of them as I start talking about the first one. I want to talk about that kind of megachurch lack of discipleship, but also to start with that word evangelical. I think part of the problem, we quote these studies. That was the Ligonier in conjunction with Barnett, I believe, was the study that we were quoting from, where like something like 47% of evangelicals didn't even know that Jesus is God. Like they believed Jesus was a created being. Well, those are shocking stats, but also I think what we have to understand is that a lot of people don't even know what evangelical means. I'm not sure anybody does. In fact, Carl Trueman argued that. He's like, there's no such thing as an evangelical mind because there's no such thing as evangelical. The word just means so many different things to so many people. If you ask me, I'm going to be thinking about the quadrilateral, emphasis on the cross, personal conversion, biblical authority, and, share evangelism, right? That was kind of the classic quadrilateral. But you ask most people today, what does evangelical mean? And they just think like racist or whatever,
Trump,
word
MAGA,
comes to their
Trump
mind.
supporter,
Donald, Trump supporter, that kind of thing. So there's like a massive, it's like an accordion word that means so many different things. So when they ask a self-professed evangelical, it might just be a Republican that goes to church. And they think, oh, I'm evangelical because I'm a Republican who goes to church. Mm-hmm. And so, but yet they are, like you said, completely biblically illiterate. But to your point, I'll just share this. I was so saddened over this past Christmas season. I have a family member who is deconstructed. Very sweet, very open about it, very honest about it, not typical of the deconstruction hashtag. So we actually even have conversations about it a lot. But this particular family member was sort of, because everybody was going to go to the Christmas Eve service, this family member agreed to go with a good attitude, by the way. It was very sweet about it. And I was so hopeful. Now, this was not my church. We didn't go to my church. We went to the church of another family member. I'm trying to keep this very vague in case any of my
You're good.
But we go. It's in this area, probably the biggest Christmas Eve service that you can go to. There's like 7 services packed with thousands of people each service. So this is like where everybody wants to go for Christmas Eve, right? And it was an absolute circus. It was an absolute circus. And they had these disco ball things that were, it was really off-putting to me. And I'm just sitting there thinking about my family member who's there who just wants something real. They want something real. And then it comes time for the message. And I'm thinking, please just share the gospel. Share the gospel. You have thousands of people in front of you over Christmas Eve, and you can share. No, they didn't share the gospel. They read a little bit from Luke 2 and basically used that to springboard into a commercial for the church and all the things that church has done this year. And it was so off-putting. And I was so grieved in my heart because what my family member needed was something simple. I'm not saying it has to be, not performed well, but something simple, something real, and then the gospel. They need to be called to repent and turn from their sin, turn to Jesus, because everything else all sounds the same. That's the message that's truly shocking and different to people when you just tell them you're a sinner in need of salvation. And then we were talking about it afterwards, and another family member was sort of discouraged about it as well. And they were saying that at their church, it's sort of the same thing. And the pastor says, well, we want to go easy because we want people to come back. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? You have thousands of people in front of you when you can share the gospel and you purposely don't do it because you want to make sure they want to come back. Well, who wants to come back to that? They can go see all of that done even better at a rock concert.
Exactly.
Why would you think they're coming back? And so, I don't know, that was a little bit of a rant, but it was so discouraging. And that just reflects the lack of discipleship. I wish that churches would understand that you don't have to apologize for the gospel. You don't have to shine it up. You don't have to put a disco ball on top of it. Just speak it. Just preach it. And trust the Holy Spirit is doing his job, Sorry, that was a rant, but...
Hey,
Hopefully that springboarded off what you were saying.
Hey, I happen to love rants. Rants are my favorite. And so especially when they come from sources I wasn't expecting. Let's try to get you onto another rant now. Well, before we get onto that, I can't remember the guy's name and I need to commit it to memory, but I found a clip from this really old preacher and it was at a G3 event or something like that. I don't even know when it happened, but this clip is absolute fire because he's like, we don't have preachers anymore. We have teachers. We have people that want to teach you things and show how smart they are, but we don't have people that are demanding that you repent and turn away from your sins and just in a full-throated fashion preach the Bible. And I was like, oh, it's like, I believe you, but I'm like, I'm ready to go to war. Let's go. Where are we going? Like that. It was one of those things. And it's like, that doesn't mean that every single pastor has to be a high school football coach in Texas. But at the same time, like there has to be some call, whether it's calmly done or whether it's screamed at the top of the lungs. But it's just like, guys, you're going to go to hell. Like, this is serious. Like, you haven't been to church. I don't care. We don't take attendance. But if you don't get right with God, it's the same thing I said when I was on Mike Glover's podcast last year, because he's a military guy. He does a lot of preparedness classes, self-defense. And it's like, great. So you've got the Ford Raptor tricked out. You've got chickens in the backyard. You've got a bug out bag. You know how to use all the different weapon systems. You know how to kill people with knives. You know how to kill people with rubber bands. So you're prepared, right? You're prepared for this world. You're not prepared for the next one because all you've done is gather a bunch of materials that the next chimp is going to take from you once you die, right? So you just made it easy for him. You just put it all in one spot so that he could take it. And so it's like you've done all this preparation, but you haven't prepared for the most important thing. Same thing here. You made it here, and here you're going to talk about stuff that you could put out in your annual report, right? Shoot a PDF to everybody's email that you have on your list. Like, don't talk about it in front of the church. We shouldn't care about it. Anyway, so there. Now I got on a rant. So we need to both maybe kind of bring it down a little bit. So let's talk about a topic that's not incendiary or controversial at all. Let's talk about the problems with parts of Calvinism. So I think in the book, there are problems with Calvinist theology, and I've talked about this a lot on the show. I've been very open about some of my struggles with some of the theology, how Calvinism, I think, could aid deconstruction specifically because of the middle letter of TULIP. So TULIP, the L is limited atonement. So I want to read a quote from your book. It's where you were talking about Derek Webb. He's the former lead singer of the Christian band Caveman's Call, who is now self-described atheist, drag queen, whatever, who the heck knows what this guy is. But this is what you describe in the book. Webb announced that he had walked away from his faith and produced a solo album he described as a deeply personal tale of two divorces. The songs are his reflections on his divorce from his wife and his divorce from God. His pain is palpable and well articulated. Responding to the Calvinist understanding of salvation Webb had formerly believed, he writes that there are only two options. Either God isn't real or Webb himself simply wasn't chosen. He goes on to say that he may never find out which is true. Either way, my heart is broken, he writes in the haunting lyrics. And this is a big sticking point for me. And I know it's a big sticking point for a lot of people in my audience. And I have a lot of like Reformed Calvinist dudes in my life and in my audience. They just don't get how I'm so stupid. How do you not understand this? I read you this Spurgeon quote. Like, you know, this explains it. We have to keep these thoughts in tension, and I want to understand. But I've asked these guys before. I have two sons. What if one of them's not elect? It doesn't matter if I send them to Christian school. It doesn't matter if I preach the gospel to them. They're just not elect. And I've yet to hear a good response to that. And so to a deconstructionist, this is jet fuel to their process, because if they understand TULIP and if they get to limited atonement, they're just like, well, I guess I'm just not elect. I'm just not chosen. So what do you have to think about that? I don't really know what Tim's leanings are, but you're not necessarily in that Reformed camp, even though a lot of people think you are. But talk a little bit more about that.
Right. Well, like you, I'm not a Calvinist. I do want to say, though, I want to do one caveat here. I actually don't think that Calvinism itself like leads to deconstruction, or that more people deconstruct out of Calvinism than they do other movements or streams or denominations. I think we see deconstruction coming out of every stream. Sure. I really do. So I don't think there's any sort of correlation between Calvinism and deconstruction. But with Derek Webb is a very interesting case. And I don't know if you follow Leighton Flowers with his Soteriology 101 podcast. It's really all about how he used to be a Calvinist and now he calls himself a provisionalist now. And so he's kind of refuting Calvinism on his podcast. But he talks about Derek Webb a lot. And he made a really interesting point on one of his podcasts that Derek Webb, even as a fully deconstructed, whatever he's calling himself now, because that changes, but secular humanist, last I heard, even as a secular humanist, he's still a Calvinist, which is so fascinating because even recently, you'll hear Derek Webb say things like, well, I guess I'm just not chosen. I'm not elect. And you're like, you're still a Calvinist, even though you're not a Christian, which is so interesting. So I recommend that to your audience to go listen to Leighton talk about that. You can go back in the archives and find it. But I do think there is a very interesting relationship between deconstructionism and Calvinism, because the ones that have deconstructed out of Calvinism will lump all of Christianity, like they will assume that everybody's soteriology is Calvinist, and that's what they're rejecting. And so that's why I remember doing a podcast with Sean McDowell, which I don't believe Sean is a 5-point Calvinist. I can't say for sure. I know that I'm not, but people were basically saying, oh, that's just their Calvinist beliefs. And I'm like thinking, well, we're actually not Calvinists, I mean, there's lots of Wesleyans, there's lots of non-Calvinist Christians who are biblically faithful and conservative. But there is sort of this bubble in the deconstruction hashtag that assigns every belief they don't like to Calvinism. They think if you believe in substitutionary atonement, you must be a Calvinist. If you believe in hell, you must be a Calvinist. So there's an interesting and very strong reaction against Calvinism in the deconstruction hashtag.
Yeah, that's why I said I was very careful, because I always have to be very careful, because there's people I love that find themselves in that camp. But that's why I say that it's jet fuel, because if you find that vein, and honestly, I was really sad when I read that quote, because I don't have an axe to grind against Derek Webb, because I didn't listen to Caedmon's Call, because I don't really like Christian music, that kind of Christian music. And so it's like, I don't really care. It's like, that's just another guy that deconstructed who's making money off of the fact that he doesn't like the life that he used to live. But hearing him talk about how sad he was, like, I believed him. He could be full of crap. I don't know. But it's like, I actually believed him to where he just got to that point where, imagine just feeling like, wow, Jesus didn't die for me. He died for the elect. Like, I had no shot, like, from the jump. Like, no matter what my parents did, no matter what kind of music I wrote, no matter what kind of drugs I took, no matter how many dresses I wear, it just wasn't in the cards for me. Gosh, it was just absolutely heartbreaking. But another through point that seems to come up a lot with deconstruction is the Bible and the church and God just seem to be just meaty, mean pants that just want to restrict you. They don't want you to have any fun. They don't want you to have any freedom. And we live in this world, whether you're super woke, purple-haired, nose ring person, or just like super duper libertarian, it's like, don't tell me what to do. I'm my own man. I can do whatever I want to do with my life, and don't give me any structure. So I'm going to read this quote here from the book. Sadly, many people want freedom from obedience. The Bible offers freedom within obedience. It's talking about an entirely different freedom from the kind offered by deconstruction. Now, this will remind you, because you call yourself a flaky artist, and so you've done a lot of art in your life. You've written a lot of songs. The thing is once an artist picks a medium, they've limited themselves. Because you, Alisa, there's only so many sounds you can make with your vocal cords. If you're sitting at a drum kit, there's only, I think your husband may have been a musician or something at some point. Drummer. There you go. Okay, yeah. I remembered. So when he sits down at the kit, there's only so many sounds he can make. Now, he can get real creative. He can hook up a bunch of weird things to it, but there is a limitation. When Michelangelo walked into the Sistine Chapel, there was a limitation. There was only so much space on the walls and the ceiling. Okay? But we just feel like any limitation of any kind is a burden when people don't understand that if we worry about limitations, then we produce nothing whatsoever. And that's on the menu for deconstruction. What do you have to say about that?
No, that's a great quote to read to lead into this kind of thought, because, years ago, I audited a soteriology class, and the professor said something that always stuck with me ever since then. And he said, when you become a Christian, you're not free. But we talk about freedom, but you're not free. you've been bought. And he brought it into this context of the first century where, this was the Roman Empire. Some scholars estimate anywhere, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 70 to 90% of people were slaves in the Roman Empire. This was a very oppressive culture. And of course, slavery meant something a little bit different than it did here in America. But you were like a bondservant to someone. You were bought with a price. And so he was talking about with salvation, when the Bible talks about you've been freed, it's talking about you being freed from sin, from being freed from the chains of sin and death. But you're not free to just go do whatever you want. You've been bought by a price. You have a new master now, and you serve Jesus. And I thought that always stuck with me because there's a lot of talk of freedom, especially in the deconstruction hashtag. It's like they want to cast off moral restraints. And I get that. I mean, that would feel good, right? It would feel good to be completely outside of any doctrinal boundaries, any sort of limitation for a moment until you start destroying yourself. And I didn't think of this analogy. I actually got this from John Lennox and his wonderful little book, Against the Flow. I don't know if you've read that, but it was his book on
right
Daniel.
over there on the shelf.
It's one of my little favorite books. It was kind of a hidden gem, I think. But he talked about music, and he's like, think about music. When you write music on a page, you have a time signature, you have a key, you're all playing in the same key, you have notes. Now imagine if you took an orchestra and said, everybody just pick your own time signature, everybody just pick your own key, and just play the notes kind of however you want to. Ready, go. It's going to sound terrible.
Disaster.
And people are going to be running out of there going, I don't want to hear this anymore. This is awful. So to your point, limitation is good, and it actually produces beauty and order is beautiful. And so I think it's just at bottom, I think our culture is so confused about what beauty is, what truth is. Like, you can't have beauty without truth. Truth is so important. And truth is encouraging. I mean, think about when a crime gets solved, when they've been looking for the killer of a crime and they finally find the killer. Like, you can breathe easy because there was order brought to it that's based on truth. But when you're just like, just do whatever you want, I mean, that's just chaos, and that's going to just lead to self-destruction and destruction of the culture.
Well, I think it's because we have this innate ability to just believe people that say they've been hurt. So as you were talking, Alisa, I thought about these people that always claim church hurt. Oh, the church hurt me. Well, if you start asking them questions and they start answering honestly, it's like, oh, the church said you should stop sinning, and you didn't like that very much. It's like, is that church hurt? Because that's very different than a youth pastor holding you down and violently sexually assaulting you. But that's where because when I say church hurt, that's where your mind goes. Church hurt is like, oh, they held you down because you're a woman. They wouldn't let you rise in the church or wouldn't let you be a leader or any of those types of things. But it's like, no, none of that happened. But you wanted to be open, and you also wanted to be celebrated in your sin. And the church said, nah. And you're just like, oh, no, and they just crumble into a puddle. Well, let me ask you a little bit about that, because I know you've talked about that before, but this whole concept of church hurt as well, we just believe these people. It's like I have this skepticism in my soul to where it's like, I don't believe what you say. Talk to me a little bit more about that, and then I'll confirm my priors or I'll change my mind. But this whole church hurt thing, I think, plays into all this as well.
Oh, it's massive. And that's probably the most difficult knot to untie, because there is a lot of legitimate church hurt. There is spiritual abuse. I speak out about that a lot because I've experienced it. And it's not always just the youth pastor holding somebody down. I mean, there's abuse of power. There's pastors, with the rise of celebrity culture, social media, the narcissism, I think, that so many pastors are drawn to can end up really having abusive effects on the parishioners who go to their churches. And so I think all of that is very real. But the problem is that when somebody claims they've been abused, like you brought up the issue of women, this is a perfect example. So, and this also shows how critical theory has come into this whole conversation, because it really informs so much of it. When you think about the definition of justice, right? So, biblically, justice is a attribute of God's character. It's who He is. Like, we have a word justice to describe who God is, and it's His perfect righteousness. So anything that falls short of that is an injustice. We have to start there before we can even think about how justice is going to meet its way out socially, right? And yet, the culture's definition of justice is equal outcome.
Right.
Now, that's, again, kind of a Marxist idea that's flowing out of Marxism, which, was economics, but now it's applied to everything. So think about women in ministry, right? A church that, now I'm a complementarian. I know you're a complementarian. So a theological belief that women and men are equal in value and worth, but have different roles to play in the church and the home, well, that's an unequal outcome.
Right.
So in the mind of the deconstructionist, in the mind of that deconstruction hashtag, that's not just a theological belief that you might hold, Kyle, or that I might hold. That's actually abuse. That's oppression, because that's an unequal outcome. If I can't do the exact same things at church that you can, or if I don't hold the same positions that you can, then I'm actually oppressed. I'm abused. So
Right.
I can claim abuse. And so that's the problem, because that's not actually abuse. That's actually beautiful, because that's order. And everybody has their roles to play, which is actually a good thing. But yet, because it's a different outcome for people, then I can actually say, well, that's a toxic environment. I've been abused by that view. Now, the problem is that there can be a beautiful expression of complementarianism, and there can be a misogynist expression of complementarianism. I think there are some Christian men who are complementarian because they're misogynist, but not everyone. Like, I'm a complementarian because I think that's what the Bible teaches, and I find it beautiful. But it can, that's why I said this is such a difficult knot to untie. It can be a very, and so I recommend doing what you said. Sit down and listen. Don't necessarily believe everything, but ask more questions. And then it will come out if that's a real abusive situation. But I was interestingly on social media one day where somebody was claiming abuse. And I made a comment like, well, people think that just being taught that Jesus died on the cross for our sins is abusive. And that same person came on and said, that is abusive to tell somebody that. So, I mean, that is a whole ball of wax that is really, really complicated.
Well, it's certainly complicated. To add to something that you said, there are people that are feminists just because they're misandrous. So people know about misogyny, the hatred of women. Well, then there's misandry, which is a hatred of men. And so it's like,
absolutely,
but you get to be celebrated, and you get probably your own holiday if you hate men. But also these people that scream for equality and equality of outcome, they never want to define what makes equal enough. Like, when is equal enough? When there are exactly the same number of male and female CEOs in America, exactly the same number of male and female professors, exactly the same number of male and female ditch diggers and bricklayers, right? They never exactly define it. And I'm not the first person to point this out, but a lot of these feminists, they love kind of cherry picking the things that they really like. It's like, oh yeah, I'll have a little bit of that. Paying for dinner? No, I don't want to have any of that. And then they just kind of like pick and choose what they have. But as we round to a close here, we need to get practical. And so this isn't just a book that describes, because I hate books that just describe, but not prescribe anything. We got to get practical about, there's a person in your life. Maybe they're a family member, maybe they're an old friend, maybe a coworker or something like that. And, you either suspect or you have confirmed that they are in the process of deconstruction. What do we do? What should the church do? What should family and friends do? How do we go about taking care of that situation?
Yeah, well, we have a whole chapter on this topic, and it's our advice chapter. And what we did was we took different relationship dynamics and applied sort of a grid to those dynamics, because it's very important to diagnose what your relationship is with the person, because how, let's say, a wife is going to respond to a husband who's in deconstruction is going to be different than how parents of a teenage child who's in deconstruction might respond, which that is going to be different than how an elderly couple is going to respond to their adult child and their grandchildren who are in deconstruction. So I think the first thing, if I would just kind of sketch it out, the first thing to do is do a little triage. We talk in the book about how when there's an accident and people start coming into the ER, doctors have to assess what is the greatest damage, what do we need to treat first. And so the guy with a punctured lung is going to get treated before the person with a broken wrist. And that's because that has a more high degree of, possibility of death, and you just want to assess these things and do some triage. So when it comes to the relationship, do triage first. If this person has fully bought into the idea that you are a toxic person, you are unsafe, and you know that, then what we say in the book is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of Christians, where we say, look, it's okay to back off. It's okay to back off, just try to stay in their life. Live the beauty of the gospel. Don't compromise your own convictions. You never have to compromise what you believe or be forced to lie or affirm something that you don't affirm. But it's okay to back off and not try to fix their theology over coffee, because this didn't happen over coffee. It's probably not going to get fixed over coffee. So it's okay to back off. And that's counterintuitive for a lot of Christians, because we're fixers. We want to fix people. if that's the case. Now, there are other cases like the person in my life who's very open and will even ask me to pray for them sometimes. And when, they're not sure they believe God exists, but they're open and there's an open dialogue. That's a different scenario. So diagnose the relationship. And so we talk through some of these things, but the one I get more than any, Kyle, is the elderly couple with the grown-up children. And so I'll maybe address that one. There have been so many people, like I said, even get no contact letters. I just met a lady a couple weeks ago who her daughter basically has her over a barrel. She says, okay, I'm not going to have a relationship with you because you're toxic and unsafe. I'll let you have relationship with my daughter. And she's even letting the grandmother take her granddaughter to church. But the daughter said, the minute anybody mentions the word hell, you're done. You're never going to see her again. So she's got her mom over a barrel like, oh my gosh, if in Sunday school they mention hell, I'm never going to see my daughter again. So these are very, very tough relationship dynamics to go through. And so what we also encourage people to do is it's okay to back off, just stay in their life. I have somebody in my life who it's been 10 years where I have backed off and we don't talk about religion. They've made that boundary clear. They don't want to talk about it. So we talk about the weather. That's what we do. That's the extent of our relationship because I honor that boundary. But in the case of the grandparent, there are going to be situations in which you may lose relationships with your kids and grandkids. And this is a good time to remind ourselves of the scripture where Jesus said, you have to, the word is sometimes translated into English as hate, but it means prefer one over the other. You have to prefer God over your children, over your grandchildren, over your spouses, over your earthly relationships. And I think that's been very theoretical for a lot of people until this kind of deconstruction explosion. This is now kind of what's real. And we may be forced to say, okay, I choose the Lord. I choose my relationship with Jesus even over these other relationships. Now, again, if it's up to you, you don't want to break that relationship. But in many cases, the person in deconstruction will break that relationship with you. And if they have done that, that's a good opportunity to assess your own spiritual life and pray. Don't underestimate the power that you have. You've not lost all control when you can pray for your loved ones. And we hear stories of people's moms and grandmas who have prayed for them for 20 years before they come to the Lord. So hold out hope. There is hope. And God's sovereign. This is not taking him by surprise. It's not like he's like, oh, everybody's leaving the faith. What do I do? I mean, I think he's maybe laying the seedbed to bring people back to him who never were with him to begin with. Who knows what he's up to? But let's stay faithful to him. Let's do what we can to keep the relationship with those who are in deconstruction in our lives. Pray and live the beauty of the gospel out in front of them, because I'm telling you, that deconstruction space is so dark, so toxic. There's no pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. And when they get to the bottom and discover that, there's a really good chance they're going to come back to you because they see the beauty of truth, of the gospel lived out in your life.
I've told a lot of people before, excuse me, is to make sure you're the right category of friend, because there are the fun friends. There are the friends that you want to be, the bridesmaid or groomsman in your wedding. These are the friends that you call when there's a party, when everybody needs to get together and do something fun. But when the chips are down and your life's falling apart, that's not the friend you're going to go to, because that's a goofball. They're the fun button, right? You need to be that friend that maybe is the challenger, maybe pushes people a little bit, maybe isn't always the most nice or polite, but when the chips are down, that's going to be they're going to run to you as fast as they can. The name of the book is The Deconstruction of Christianity. It's a fantastic read, guys. It is out now if you're listening to this on time. But before we let you go, what are you working on now? What's the next book? What's the next project? Because I don't believe you that you're taking time off. Get out of here with that mess.
Right now, I am working on not writing a book right now. That's what I'm working on. Yeah. Oh man, I'm honestly, I've just gotten off sabbatical, so I've been enjoying perfecting my bread recipes, making lots of bread and brioche and all sorts of fun stuff. Maybe it's a cookbook. Maybe it'll be a cookbook in a couple years. I don't know. Okay. I would love to do that.
All right.
That's a little bit of a left turn, but I might.
Hey, so was ZOEgirl to what you're doing now, so why don't you just yank the wheel into the guardrails again? But hey, does this bread ship well? I mean, asking for a friend. Does it?
Absolutely. Yes, I will ship you some.
Oh, well, thanks for the offer. I wasn't even thinking about that. Yeah, sure. I would love to have some bread. No, Alisa, it is always a pleasure. You're an absolute peach in this movement. I just love the fact that you're doing what you're doing. You're hitting a very specific audience in a very specific way. We need about 1,000 more of you, but we're glad that we have you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Kyle.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the return appearance of Alisa Childers on our show. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So in the notes here, I've got the link to the new book, The Deconstruction of Christianity. I've also got the study guide link in here so you guys can check that out. That comes out a little bit later. I've got links to her other books that she has released that we've talked about here on the show, and then links to her website, Instagram channel, socials, her previous appearances on this show, and all those things there. You can just check it out there. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@undaunted.life. That's info@undaunted.life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.undaunted.life. And also, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.